Good morning, fourth grade. Today we are going to be reviewing the parts of the food chain. Before we get started with our lesson, I want to remind you that we will have our test about food chains and ecosystem on May 6th. That is next Thursday. I shared a study guide and a Quizlet onto Google Classroom. Make sure you are using those two resources to study. I will also be stopping by your homerooms next week to review with you, and if you have any questions, you can ask it then. Let's get started on our lesson. Here we have a copy of a forest food chain. We see there are different plants and different types of animals and even humans. We see how these different organisms all play a part in this forest environment. The arrows that are pointing to these different organisms show how the energy is transferred from one organism to the next. For example, the grass, there are two arrows. This first arrow is pointing to this deer mouse. The arrow tells us that the deer mouse eats the grass for energy. However, grass is also eaten by a grizzly bear. The grass provides energy for both the grizzly bear and the deer. All these different types of plants, the red elderberry grass, the sitka spruce, the stinging nettle, and the skunk cabbage, these are all plants and they are producers. However, if one of these plants were missing, that would be very harmful for the environment. Because let's say if there was no more grass, if the grass just disappeared, that means that the deer and the grizzly bear would have less food to eat. And that means that they would have to find other food to eat. And if there is not enough food in the environment, they can starve. Now let's take a close look at all the roles that these different levels in this food chain play. At the bottom of the food chain, we have producers. Producers are all types of plants. Producers are those organisms that they don't need to eat other organisms for energy. They are able to use light from the sun to produce their own sugars for energy. And then above producers, we have these different types of consumers. All these organisms are consumers. Consumers eat other organisms for their energy. They cannot make their own food. And there are different types of consumers. There are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. We're going to be taking a close look about what each of these names mean and how they are part of an ecosystem. Let's start with producers. As I mentioned before, producers are organisms who are able to make their own food. They use the sun rays that shine down on these organisms help them make energy. Most producers are the start of every food chain, like plants, vegetables, algae, kelp. All these different plants are the base of the food system. Without these producers, other organisms would not have anywhere to get their food. Now let's look at another part of the food chain. Our next part of our food chain are consumers. Consumers are all types of organisms that cannot make their own food. Consumers are organisms who have to eat other organisms for their energy. There are three different types of consumers. These consumers depend on other organisms for energy, but some of these consumers have different taste on what they like to eat. Some examples of consumers are a rabbit, lion, and bear. All these three consumers eat different food, but they are still consumers because they cannot make their own food and rely on other organisms for their energy. Let's start with our first one, which is herbivores. Herbivores are one type of consumer. Herbivores are those organisms that only eat plants, like rabbits, rats, or deer. These are examples of herbivores because their food or their diet on how they get their energy is by mainly eating grass or different types of flowers. Herbivores are still consumers, they just only eat plants. Now, there are other consumers who eat more than plants. They are called carnivores. Carnivores are another type of consumer. These consumers only eat meat. Carnivore, their diet consists of maybe eating other animals. Maybe like some carnivores will eat other herbivores since they are much smaller. Carnivores like a snake, an eagle, or a wolf will eat other smaller animals for their energy. A good way I like to think about what a carnivore eats, the word carnivores, it kind of sounds like the Spanish word carne, which carne it means meat. These carnivores eat meat. They only like to eat meat in their diet. Now, we talked about herbivores and we talked about carnivores, but there are also another type of consumer. This other type of consumer, their diet is different. They are called omnivores. Omnivores are also consumers. The difference between omnivores is that they will eat both plants, like flowers or vegetables or grass, and also other animals that have meat. Omnivores will eat other carnivores, they will eat herbivores, and they will even eat producers, like for example, vegetables. Chickens, for example, can eat grass, but will also eat small insects. Pigs, bears, and people are also examples of omnivores. We are all consumers, but the types of food that omnivores like to eat include both plants and animals. Now that we have reviewed the different parts of a food chain and the roles that each organism play, let's take a look at this food chain. This food chain starts with a plant. I noticed there are two arrows from the plant. One arrow points to the rabbit and the other arrow points to the deer. Tell me on Ed Puzzle now, what type of consumer are the deer and the rabbit? They only eat plants. Is it a carnivore or an herbivore? If you said herbivore, that is correct. Rabbits and deers are examples of herbivore because their diets mainly consist of plants. Let's look at the next level of consumers. Now that we know that both the rabbit and the deer are examples of herbivores, let's look at the next level. If we follow the rabbit, we see there are two arrows, one pointing to a cougar and then one also pointing to the mountain lion. I have a question. What type of consumer is the cougar? He eats a rabbit. What kind of consumer does it make it? An herbivore or a carnivore? If you said carnivore, that is correct. The cougar is a carnivore because it is eating another animal and its main diet consists of meat. Now my last question is, we see that we have a rabbit, deer, mountain lion, and cougar. True or false? All of these animals, the rabbit, deer, mountain lion, and cougar, they are all consumers. Is that true or false? If you said true, that is correct. The rabbit, cougar, deer, and mountain lion are all examples of consumers because they have to consume or eat other organisms for energy. They cannot produce or make their own energy like the plant. The plant is the only producer in this food chain. Our test will be next Thursday, May 6th. We will see a similar food chain to this one. Make sure you are reviewing your study guide using Quizlet to prepare for the test. If you have any questions, please visit me during office hours and I can help you study. Have a great day and I will see you tomorrow.